300 engineers had failed to move the $2 billion bullet train, and the countdown to the public demonstration had dropped to 10 minutes. When the widowed janitor offered to check the control panel, CEO Victoria Sterling laughed in front of the entire board. "Make it move, and this company is yours." No one in that terminal knew that Owen Barrett had once designed the very heart of that train before someone erased his name from the project. He crouched down, removed a single fuse, and entered 6 characters. The train moved. Stay until the end to find out whether Owen wanted the company, the train, or the man who had betrayed him. Blackridge Terminal had been transformed into something between a command center and a theater. Every surface polished, every cable hidden, the entire facility remade to project the image of a company that had already won. Representatives from the Federal Transportation Authority occupied the front rows of the observation deck, their briefcases thick with paperwork for a $12 billion rail corridor contract that would define the next 2 decades of American infrastructure. Investors from 3 continents stood in clusters near the glass wall, watching the Sterling Arrow X1 sit motionless on the demonstration track while engineers in pressed uniforms moved around it with the quiet urgency of people who knew the clock was running out. Victoria Sterling stood at the center of it all, her posture straight, her expression engineered to radiate calm, though the communications director had already whispered to her twice that the board was watching her hands, and she needed to stop pressing them together. The Arrow X1 was the culmination of a $2 billion development program the machine Sterling Rail Systems had staked its financial survival on, and it was supposed to reach a test speed of 230 miles per hour in front of every camera in California. If the demonstration succeeded, Sterling would secure the contract, and everything the company had borrowed to build that train would become leverage for the next decade of growth. If it failed, the banks had the right to freeze the credit line, and the board had enough votes to remove Victoria from the position she had inherited and, she believed, earned. Instead, the Arrow X1 sat completely still, and the central display inside the control module was showing a message that no one in the engineering division had seen trigger in a live environment. Integrity conflict. Sentinel hold. 300 engineers had been cycling through every accessible subsystem for 2 hours, running diagnostics on the electrical grid, the propulsion units, the brake assembly, and the navigation software, and not one of them had found a fault that explained why the system refused to release. Jonah Keene, the chief engineer of the Arrow X1 program, was working through his 4th diagnostic pass when Malcolm Blackwood appeared behind him and said, with the practiced calmness of a man who had survived many boardroom crises, that the safety warning needed to be bypassed so the demonstration could proceed on schedule. Jonah refused because the Sentinel protocol was a core safety architecture, and he had no understanding of what it had detected, and bypassing it without knowing the trigger would be the kind of decision that ended careers and, in the worst scenario, something far worse than careers. Blackwood did not argue further. He simply turned and began working the room, reassuring investors that the delay was a calibration issue, nothing structural, the kind of thing that happened when you pushed engineering to its absolute edge. Owen Barrett was mopping the floor near the secondary control alcove when he heard the Sentinel error read aloud for the 3rd time. He had been working the night shift at Blackridge Terminal for 14 months, and in that time he had learned to recognize the rhythms of the facility the way a musician learns the acoustics of a hall, not by studying the blueprints, but by listening to what the building said when it thought no one was paying attention. The cooling pump beneath the Arrow X1's primary brake manifold was cycling at a frequency that told him the system was not broken. It was actively refusing to start, which was a fundamentally different condition, one that most engineers would misread as a malfunction rather than a decision made by the architecture itself. He stopped mopping, looked at Jonah, and said, quietly enough that only the immediate circle could hear, that the diagnostic team should check the connector bridge located behind panel 4 of the main control cabinet, the one that was not on the standard schematic. Jonah turned and regarded him the way a surgeon might look at a hospital visitor who had just suggested an alternative incision site, not with anger exactly, but with the particular weariness of expertise confronting what it assumed was uninformed enthusiasm. He told Owen that the schematic they were working from did not include that component. Owen looked at him steadily and said, "That's because the schematic you're using isn't the original." Victoria Sterling heard those 6 words from 12 feet away, and something in their flatness made her stop mid-sentence with a government liaison. She crossed the floor, looked at the man in the gray maintenance uniform holding the mop, and asked him, with a courtesy she would later regret the condescension embedded in, whether he genuinely believed he could succeed where 300 credentialed engineers had not. Owen said he needed 10 minutes. Victoria looked at the cameras, at the board members, at the clock showing the demonstration was now running 9 minutes behind schedule, and she laughed, and the laugh was not entirely performance, because part of her genuinely found the situation too absurd to process with full dignity. "Make it move," she said, loud enough for every recording device in the room to capture without ambiguity, "and this company is yours." Owen looked at her, and then at the people arranged behind her, and asked, with no particular inflection, whether everyone present had heard that clearly. Victoria nodded, confident she was about to watch a man walk himself into public humiliation. Owen set the mop against the wall and walked into the control module without looking at the instruction panel beside the door. Owen did not go to the components the engineering team had spent hours disassembling and reassembling. He moved directly to a secondary access panel on the far interior wall of the module, the kind of surface that accumulates fine, undisturbed dust in facilities where no one thinks to look behind it, and he removed it in under 30 seconds using a tool from his maintenance belt. Behind the panel was a diagnostic junction that had been installed during the construction of the very first prototype, a hardwired access point for the Sentinel system that predated every revision the engineering division had made in the years since. Jonah Keene watched from the doorway with an expression that had begun to shift from condescension to something closer to troubled recognition, because the connector Owen had just exposed was not present in any document Jonah had been given access to, and a man who knew exactly where to find an unlisted component in a piece of technology he supposedly had no connection to was not behaving like a maintenance worker who had gotten fortunate with a guess. The room was very quiet, and the quiet had a different quality than it had held 5 minutes earlier. Owen examined the junction for less than 90 seconds before finding what he was looking for. A diagnostic fuse had been installed at the wrong amperage rating, not dramatically wrong, not the kind of error that triggered an immediate failure, but wrong in the specific way that would cause Sentinel to read the connected brake controller as an unverified component rather than a certified one. The brake controller itself, when he pulled its identification data, returned a hardware signature that did not match the configuration stored in the original system record. The train had not malfunctioned. Sentinel had recognized a discrepancy between the components it had been certified with and the components currently installed in its body, and it had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had refused to release the brakes until the conflict was resolved by someone with the authority and knowledge to resolve it correctly. Owen did not override the safety architecture. He restored maintenance access through the original protocol, entered 6 characters that he had not needed to look up, and switched the Aero X1 into the slow crawl mode used during factory floor movements, a mode that operated the drivetrain at minimal power with no high-speed brake engagement required. The last character was entered with 13 seconds remaining on the demonstration countdown clock. The forward lights of the Aero X1 came on with a sound like a long-held breath released. The drive system engaged with a low, steady resonance that was nothing like the strained cycling the engineers had been hearing for hours. The train, 340 tons of the most advanced rail technology in the country, began to move, rolling forward slowly and smoothly, and without hesitation, as though it had simply been waiting for someone to ask it in a language it recognized. Every person in Black Ridge Terminal stopped what they were doing at exactly the same moment. Victoria Sterling stood at the glass wall and watched the machine she had staked her career on begin to roll, moved not by any of the 300 engineers who had been paid to understand it, but by a man in a maintenance uniform whose name she had never asked before that morning. Then Owen stopped it. After approximately 40 feet, he brought the Aero X1 to a full stop, walked back to the diagnostic junction, and removed the brake controller from its housing with both hands. He carried it to the table at the center of the control room and set it down in front of every camera in the facility, and the serial number on the component's casing had been ground off and re-engraved, the surface around the characters slightly rougher than the original finish, under the right angle of light. He turned to the room and said in the same flat, precise tone he had used all morning, "I didn't fix this train. I just proved it was trying to save your lives." Sentinel had detected a brake controller, whose thermal tolerance did not meet the specifications required for sustained high-speed operation, and running the demonstration at full speed with those components installed would have risked brake fade at 200 miles per hour. On a test track, in front of the exact people the company had invited to trust it with a $12 billion contract. Blackwood moved quickly. He stepped forward and told the assembled board and investors that Owen had deliberately installed the corrupted components to sabotage the demonstration, that the Sentinel lock was his doing, and that what they had just witnessed was an act of calculated industrial revenge by a disgruntled former contractor who had spent years waiting for access. Victoria listened to Blackwood speak, and something began to resolve in her memory. A name from a file her father had shown her years ago, a name he had spoken with an anger she had not entirely understood at the time. She looked at Owen and said it aloud, in front of everyone. Owen Barrett had not come to Black Ridge Terminal as a janitor. 7 years ago, he was the man her father had called the most dangerous saboteur Sterling Rail Systems had ever faced. Security brought Owen to the operations room, and he went without resistance, without raising his voice, and without making any reference to the promise Victoria had made in front of every recording device in the building. Blackwood framed the situation quickly, and with the fluency of a man who had spent decades translating inconvenient realities into manageable narratives. The story, as he told it to the board, was that Owen had used his position as a night shift maintenance worker to gain unauthorized access to restricted engineering systems, that the Sentinel lockout had been created by him rather than triggered by him, and that the entire morning had been a staged demonstration designed to make himself appear as a savior at the precise moment he had arranged for the crisis to occur. It was a coherent story fitted carefully around the available evidence, with the kind of internal logic that made it difficult to argue against in a room where the facts had not yet been fully assembled. Owen said nothing while Blackwood spoke because he had been in this room before, or a room exactly like it, and he understood that the person who argued loudest against evidence they hadn't planted was usually the one who looked guilty. 7 years earlier, Owen Barrett had been the youngest system architect in Sterling Rail Systems history, having risen faster than anyone on the technical staff expected, or, in some cases, welcomed. He had co-designed the Sentinel safety protocol from the ground up, building it specifically to detect the kind of component integrity failures that could cause high-speed rail disasters, a system he described in the original design documentation as the nervous system of the train's decision to trust itself, language that the engineers around him had found either poetic or excessive, depending on whether they had worked with him long enough to see how thoroughly he meant it. During the development of the Aero Zero prototype, he had identified a batch of newly sourced brake controllers that failed thermal tolerance testing at sustained speeds. He had refused to sign the safety certification and had sent a formal written warning directly to Harrison Sterling, not to Blackwood, and not through any channel that Blackwood controlled. Before the internal investigation could be completed, Aero Zero had been sent out for a test run under an executive authorization that did not bear Owen's signature. The brake system responded sluggishly at the end of the test corridor, causing the prototype to slide from the track at low speed in the final deceleration zone. No one was killed, but the damage to the equipment and the surrounding infrastructure was severe. The financial loss ran into the hundreds of millions, and the reputational damage arrived on the front pages of every industry publication within 24 hours. The post-incident data review produced evidence that code in Owen's section of the Sentinel architecture had suppressed a safety warning, evidence that had been placed there after the fact by someone with administrative access to the codebase, though Owen had no mechanism to prove this in the timeline he was given. He was terminated, sued for breach of confidentiality agreements, and placed on the industry's informal no-hire list. His name was removed from every internal document associated with the Sentinel protocol. In the years that followed, his wife became ill. The legal defense consumed everything he had saved, and when she died, he was left with a daughter starting college and a maintenance job at Blackridge Terminal that provided health coverage and kept him, every night, inside the building that held the machine he had built. When Victoria told the room that her father had called him dangerous, Owen did not flinch or redirect. He said her father had signed a great many documents in his final years, and the relevant question was whether Harrison Sterling had always understood what he was authorizing when he signed them. Victoria said her father would never have knowingly destroyed an innocent man's career. Owen met her eyes and said nothing to that, which was its own kind of answer. In the adjacent office, Charlotte Langford, Sterling's chief legal officer, had pulled the original patent filing for the Sentinel protocol from the federal database and had expected to find that Owen Barrett's name had been cleanly removed from the record, consistent with everything in the internal archive. Instead, she found that the original filing still carried his name as co-inventor. An oversight in the erasure, a document processed before Blackwood had completed his revision of the official history. More importantly, the patent contained a specific operational clause. In the event that a Sentinel integrity conflict was triggered by a component discrepancy, any named co-inventor retained the right to request independent technical verification before the vehicle resumed operation. That clause had never been removed. It was still legally active. It meant that Victoria had no choice but to halt the demonstration and permit Owen's participation in the full inspection, regardless of Blackwood's position, regardless of the board's anxiety about the investors currently waiting in the facility's atrium. Owen thanked Charlotte and said he would need to examine all 47 brake controllers currently installed across the Sterling fleet, not only the Aero X1. The inspection was conducted under the joint oversight of Owen, Jonah, and an independent materials laboratory that Charlotte had contacted within the hour. The process was methodical and completely unhurried. Owen moved through each controller the way someone moves through a building they designed, knowing which walls carry load and which are decoration, knowing which tolerances matter and which are cosmetic. Jonah worked beside him through the entire process, and somewhere in the second hour the chief engineer stopped arguing with the methodology and started paying close attention to it, because the way Owen identified discrepancies was not the way someone reverse engineers an unfamiliar system, but the way someone recognizes deviations from their own original specifications, pointing to structural decisions that existed for reasons no current document explained. The testing was quiet, technical, and deeply uncomfortable for everyone watching from the perimeter of the laboratory. The results were precise and devastating. 16 of the 47 brake controllers carried Stirling Rail Systems casings and serial numbers, but their internal cores had been manufactured by an uncertified supplier operating outside the federal certification framework. The components met basic functionality standards at low speeds and under normal operating temperatures, but at the brake temperatures generated by sustained high-speed deceleration, their thermal tolerance degraded in ways that the standard certification process had never been designed to catch. Every one of those 16 controllers had a digital certification document attached to its procurement record, each bearing the electronic signature of the Engineering Compliance Department. And Jonah reviewed those signatures and said, with visible distress, that he did not recognize the authorization pathway. The signatures had been appended after the compliance reports were finalized, attached through an administrative access channel that the engineering team did not use and had not, until that afternoon, known existed. Owen recognized the method immediately and without needing to describe it at length. It was structurally identical to the technique that had been used to attach falsified code to his section of the Aero Zero Sentinel architecture 7 years earlier. The same backdoor, the same documentary layering, the same approach of making the fraud look like a process outcome rather than a deliberate act. The procurement trail for the 16 counterfeit controllers led to a company called Crown Peak Dynamics, a supplier that Blackwood had introduced to the Stirling Purchasing Department 18 months earlier. With documentation that described an established manufacturing operation, Crown Peak's registration listed a production facility in Nevada, and the address corresponded to a leased storage unit that had been vacant for over a year. Victoria called Blackwood into the inspection room and asked him directly to explain the relationship between Stirling and Crown Peak Dynamics, and he said the supplier had been personally approved by her father and produced a signed authorization document bearing Harrison Stirling's signature. Owen examined the document, noted the date, and said, without raising his voice, that her father had suffered a debilitating stroke 4 months before that authorization had been dated, a condition that had left him unable to process complex business decisions, a fact that Blackwood understood better than anyone in the building. Victoria had been absorbing information for hours with the controlled discipline of someone who had trained herself not to react visibly under pressure, because that was what the role of chief executive had required from the first day she sat in the chair. But she was approaching something that felt like vertigo, because the architecture of the day was resolving into a shape she had not been prepared to see. She did not want to believe that Malcolm Blackwood, the man who had run her father's operations for 2 decades, who had guided her through the first years of her tenure, who had always seemed to be the person the room oriented toward when clarity was needed, had built a fraudulent supply chain engineered to fail at precisely the worst moment. Owen did not push her past her own resistance. He simply asked her to consider who benefited if the Aero X1 failed catastrophically during a nationally televised demonstration. Victoria would be removed by the board. The stock would collapse. A buyer currently accumulating Stirling's distressed debt would be positioned to acquire the company at a fraction of its value, and Blackwood had already been formally nominated as interim CEO pending any disciplinary action against Victoria. a nomination placed in the board minutes 3 weeks before the demonstration was scheduled. Then Owen's phone rang, and he answered it without excusing himself from the room, and the conversation that followed was entirely about whether his daughter had submitted her industrial design presentation on time and whether she had eaten a proper meal before her review session. Victoria Sterling watched the man who had just dismantled the credibility of her most trusted executive spend 3 minutes making sure a college freshman had eaten breakfast before her morning critique. It changed nothing about the facts on the table, but it changed something about her understanding of what this man wanted from the building he was standing in, and it was not what she had assumed a person in his position would naturally want. The security camera footage from the component storage bay showed Owen Barrett entering the restricted area at 2 in the morning on the exact night the controllers had been switched. Blackwood presented the footage to the board with the composure of someone releasing a hand he had been holding for exactly this moment. The implication was complete. Owen had used his maintenance credentials to move through the facility unquestioned, had entered the restricted bay in the early hours, and had replaced the certified controllers with counterfeit parts before engineering the Sentinel lockout as cover, allowing him to appear as a rescuer at the moment he had arranged for the crisis to peak, while positioning himself to collect on the public promise Victoria had made. The search of Owen's locker produced a handheld programming interface capable of accessing Sterling's diagnostic systems, a printed copy of the Sentinel access codes, serial number stickers matching the specifications of the counterfeit controllers, and documentation connecting a financial account to payments from Crown Peak Dynamics. Each item had been placed with the thoroughness of a professional performance rather than the scattered findings of a genuine investigation, and Owen looked at each one as it was placed on the table and said nothing, because arguing loudly against evidence you did not plant was, in his experience, rarely what changed the outcome. Charlotte was already working through the financial records before Blackwood finished presenting the locker contents. The account connected to Crown Peak payments had been opened using Owen's Social Security number, but the listed address corresponded to an apartment in a district Owen had never lived in, confirmed against his rental history and utility records Charlotte's office pulled within the hour. The programming interface found in the locker carried a manufacture date from a production run that occurred after the date Owen had been placed on the industry restricted access list. A device he could not have legally obtained through any registered channel and would have had no legitimate mechanism to acquire. The certification stickers matched a Crown Peak batch ordered 6 weeks earlier, 3 years after Owen's access to Sterling's supply chain had been formally terminated. Jonah had returned to the security footage with attention calibrated more finely than Blackwood had expected. The detail he found was small enough that it would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for inconsistencies in the background of the frame rather than the subject. The maintenance cart in the hallway outside the storage bay did not carry the blue chemical storage container that Owen kept in the same position on every shift for 14 months, a container documented in every other piece of footage from his time at the facility because it was part of his standard equipment kit and facility regulations required it to be visible and accessible throughout the shift. In the footage from the night of the switch, it was absent. 2 segments of footage from different calendar dates had been composited at a timestamp splice so clean it required frame-by-frame comparison to detect. Despite this, the board voted to proceed with a limited-speed demonstration run, arguing that the financial exposure of a second cancellation in a single day was not survivable, and that the unresolved questions could be addressed through a formal investigation after the contract paperwork had been secured. Owen was permitted to leave the facility but was barred from returning to the terminal for any purpose. Before he left, he found Victoria alone in the exit corridor and told her that the counterfeit controllers were the visible problem and not the actual threat. That if Blackwood needed the Aero X1 to fail in a specific way at a specific moment, he would not rely on a mechanical component issue that could be caught and replaced before the run, because that method had already been exposed. Victoria asked why Owen was still trying to help a company that had taken everything from him. He said he was not helping the company. He was thinking about the people who would be seated on that train when it entered the high-speed segment. Owen took the bus back to his apartment and found Avery awake, watching a news broadcast that had placed his face beside the words "Suspected Saboteur" in a lower third graphic. She did not ask him whether the story was true because she had grown up watching her father make decisions based on what was right rather than what was convenient, and she already had her answer. She handed him a small wooden box that had traveled with them through 4 apartments without ever being opened. The return address was Sterling Rail Systems. It had arrived at an old address years ago when the legal proceedings were consuming everything, and Owen had not been able to read anything that came from that building for a long time. Inside was a letter from Harrison Sterling, written in the months before his stroke, addressed to Owen by name. Harrison wrote that he had found something he could not continue to carry. He had hidden the evidence in what he called the first heart of the arrow, and he had hoped there would still be time to give Owen back what had been taken from him. The phrase "the first heart of the arrow" was not a poetic construction Harrison Sterling had invented on his own. It was the name Owen himself had given to the central processing module of the Aero Zero prototype during the original development period, a name that appeared in his design notes from the first year of the project and nowhere in any official document, because it was the kind of thing an engineer called something when he believed he was building something that would last. The Aero Zero prototype was not in active service. It occupied a climate-controlled display alcove in Sterling's Internal Engineering Museum at the far end of Blackridge Terminal, framed by photographs of the team that had built it, though Owen's photograph was not among them. Charlotte confirmed that the co-inventor clause in the Sentinel patent gave Owen legal standing to inspect the original prototype hardware without requiring authorization from Blackwood or any operational leadership. Victoria chose to accompany them, despite the fact that the board had formally restricted her executive authority pending the internal review that Blackwood had requested. She did not ask anyone's permission. She walked through the facility using the card that still opened every door in the building she had run for 6 years, and no one moved to block her. The central processing module of the Aero Zero was sealed in a preservation case. Owen released the mechanism without consulting the label beside it. Inside, mounted to the rear housing in a position visible only to someone who knew the original assembly sequence, was a compact data storage unit, sealed in a thermal casing connected by a short cable to a port that drew current from the prototype standby circuit, positioned to survive indefinitely in a powered display without any maintenance. The encryption key required to access the drive was the original Sentinel initialization sequence, a string of characters that had not been entered by any hand since the day the protocol first came online. Owen entered it from memory. The drive contained everything Harrison Sterling had managed to gather in the months before his stroke removed his capacity to act on it. Original procurement records showing that the brake controllers installed in Aero Zero's final test run had been replaced without engineering authorization, sourced through the same uncertified supply chain that Crown Peak Dynamics would later replicate on a larger scale. Email correspondence in which Blackwood had pressured the technical team to proceed with the test run despite Owen's documented objections, using language that made clear he understood the risk he was asking them to accept and had decided the schedule mattered more. A recording of a private meeting between Harrison and Blackwood, made by Harrison without Blackwood's knowledge, using a device Harrison had not mentioned to anyone, in which Blackwood had proposed deflecting all accountability for the Aero Zero incident onto Owen in exchange for a commitment that the defective components would be quietly replaced across the entire fleet so the problem would disappear before it could be traced. Harrison's voice in that recording was not the voice of a man who had been deceived and was only now learning the truth. It was the voice of a man making a calculation he already understood was wrong, accepting an arrangement because he could not see another way through that did not cost him everything he had built. Harrison had known Owen was innocent. He had chosen to protect the company and his own legacy rather than the engineer who had tried to protect everyone who would ever board a train built on technology Owen had designed. When Blackwood continued expanding the counterfeit supply chain rather than eliminating it, Harrison had begun to understand what he had agreed to enable and had started gathering evidence, hiding it in the one location that required Owen's original knowledge to find. The stroke arrived before Harrison could reach him directly, before the letter found the right address, before the truth could move faster than the disease. Victoria stood in the museum and listened to her father's recorded voice instruct another man to destroy an innocent person's career, and she did not search for a reading of those words that made them mean something more forgivable. She told Owen she was sorry, not only for that morning, but for the years, for the work taken from him, for every door that had closed because someone carrying her family's name had signed a document they knew was a lie. Owen said the worst part of that morning had not been her failure to recognize him as an engineer. It was her assumption that a man's uniform settled the question of whether he deserved to be heard. Victoria said she knew he was right. The data drive also contained a signed agreement between Blackwood and an investment fund called Kingsley Capital, structured to allow the fund to acquire sterling at a distressed valuation once the Aero X1 demonstration produced a catastrophic failure of sufficient public visibility. Blackwood's compensation package included equity and the chief executive position of the reorganized entity. The agreement was dated 3 weeks before Blackwood had begun routing Sterling's brake controller procurement through Crown Peak Dynamics. A scheduled remote software update was queued to activate in 30 minutes, timed to coincide precisely with the restarted demonstration run. Blackwood had returned the Aero X1 to the demonstration track with documentation confirming that all flagged components had been replaced, and the board had accepted this because the financial exposure of a second cancellation was severe, and because Blackwood had spent 20 years becoming the person that room turned to when it needed to believe things were under control. There were no members of the public in the train's passenger section, but the observation car carried board members, federal transportation representatives, and institutional investors who had traveled significant distances for the demonstration and whose continued patience was not unlimited. Victoria had boarded with them, not because she believed the run was safe, but because she understood that if something went wrong, she needed to be in position to contain the outcome rather than to explain it from a safe distance afterward. Owen had used the time in the engineering museum to map precisely what the remote update was designed to execute. It would disable the Sentinel architecture through a remote administrative channel, feed falsified thermal readings to the brake monitoring display so that developing instability would be invisible to the crew, sever the communication link between the train and the ground operations center, and then log the failure sequence in a way that pointed to a corrupted initialization file in the original Sentinel codebase. The section of the code that carried Owen Barrett's name in the original version and would carry it again in the failure report for anyone who looked. If the Aero X1 lost braking control at high speed, the forensic record would identify Owen's original architecture as the source. Blackwood would have a disaster and a villain available simultaneously, and Kingsley Capital would have a company to purchase at the price they had agreed to pay. Owen, Jonah, and Charlotte reached Blackridge Terminal through the emergency access provision attached to the co-inventor clause. Arriving at the operations center door, at the moment the Aero X1 was beginning to accelerate onto the test corridor. Blackwood ordered security to block them from the room. Victoria, using the executive authority that the board had restricted but not formally terminated, countermanded the order over the internal communication system. Blackwood did not argue with this. He moved to his own terminal and began working quickly with the focused efficiency of someone executing a plan they had rehearsed many times. The remote update activated. Sentinel lost its ground connection. The brake temperature display in the operations center began showing data that bore no relationship to what the sensors were actually reading. Owen discovered that Blackwood had locked the main control interface behind an administrative credential change executed that morning, a change that required a reauthorization process that would take longer than they had. But Owen knew something Blackwood had not accounted for. The original Aero Zero design had included an analog maintenance channel, a hardwired diagnostic pathway that predated the digital architecture and had been carried into the X1 as a grandfathered legacy system, listed in no current technical document, connecting directly to a secondary processor that sat entirely outside the update's reach. Owen connected through it in under 4 minutes. He could not stop the train through the primary drive system. What he could do was restore Sentinel's ability to compare actual brake temperatures against the falsified display data, trigger the emergency response protocol through the backup circuit, and bring the train to a controlled stop within the designated deceleration zone before it entered the high-speed test segment. To accomplish this, he needed Victoria to authorize a full power reduction on the main traction supply simultaneously, because the backup braking system required a drop in primary power to engage without a conflict that would cascade unpredictably. Victoria was in the observation car, connected to the operations center through the single radio channel, still functioning through the analog pathway. Owen explained what he needed in the time it took her to understand it. She understood it immediately. She also understood what it meant: a public and nationally broadcast failure of the Aero X1 demonstration, the loss of the $12 billion contract, a financial crisis that would reach every person employed by Sterling Rail Systems, and the end of the version of the company her father had spent his life constructing. She authorized the power reduction without pausing to weigh it further. The Aero X1 switched to backup power. Propulsion cut. The secondary brakes engaged across 1,000 feet of deceleration track with a resonance that the passengers felt through the floor before they heard it through the air. The train slowed steadily and came to a complete stop well within the emergency zone, before the high-speed segment, with every person aboard upright and unhurt. The demonstration had failed in front of every broadcast outlet covering it. The train had stopped, the bets and the contracts, and the $12 billion promise had stopped with it, and the data from the remote update command traced directly to Blackwood's operations terminal in a chain of records he had not anticipated anyone would be positioned to read. Blackwood told the investigators that his terminal had been accessed by Owen through the analog maintenance channel, that Owen had used his original system knowledge to stage a remote intrusion designed to look like it originated from Blackwood's workstation, the same technique a man with his background might logically employ. Charlotte began presenting documents, and the theory did not survive the first hour of scrutiny. The Aero Zero procurement records with the unauthorized component substitution. The email correspondence in which Blackwood had overridden Owen's safety refusal. The private recording in Harrison Sterling's voice. The Crown Peak Dynamics Shell Company structure with its empty Nevada address. The Kingsley Capital acquisition agreement dated 3 weeks before the counterfeit components entered the supply chain. The administrative credential change logged at Blackwood's personal workstation on the morning of the demonstration. Timestamped, authenticated, and associated with an IP address that placed it at a physical terminal to which only Blackwood had assigned access. Jonah delivered the final technical piece with the precision of someone who had spent the past several hours wanting to be wrong about what he was finding. The remote update package had been compiled using a master administrative key issued to 3 people in Sterling's entire operational history. One of whom was deceased. One of whom was Owen Barrett, whose access had been formally revoked 7 years earlier and never reinstated under any credential. And one of whom was Malcolm Blackwood. Federal investigators secured the financial servers before the end of the day and took Blackwood from the building for questioning on charges that included fraudulent safety certification, procurement fraud, obstruction of a corporate safety investigation, and deliberate sabotage of a federally regulated transportation asset. He walked to the vehicle with the same composure he had carried through every difficult meeting, and the performance held until the door closed behind him. The board convened within hours. The first question they asked Victoria was not about the investigation or the company's financial exposure. It was about the statement she had made on camera that morning, before witnesses numbering in the hundreds and a broadcast audience that had already generated significant legal commentary before the demonstration had finished failing. Charlotte addressed this with the practical clarity that had made her indispensable to every general counsel she had preceded at the company. Sterling Rail Systems could not be transferred as a personal asset under any circumstances, given its shareholder structure, debt obligations, collective labor agreements, and regulatory standing. Victoria's statement had not created a legal mechanism for transferring a corporation. What it had created was a documented promise whose non-fulfillment would generate substantial legal exposure and reputational damage to the company and to Victoria personally. And this needed to be addressed structurally rather than rhetorically. Victoria asked Charlotte what she could actually do within the law to honor what she had said. Charlotte told her that through the Sterling Family Trust, Victoria controlled 51% of the voting shares, a control position that could be transferred or restructured at her discretion. She began to draft paperwork. Owen stopped her. He said that moving 18,000 people's livelihoods into his personal ownership because a CEO had made a reckless promise in a desperate moment was not justice. It was just a different arrangement that served one person at the expense of everyone else. He told Victoria what he actually wanted. He wanted his name restored to every patent and design document from which it had been removed. He wanted an independent safety oversight board with binding authority to halt any Sterling project pending full technical review, without appeal. He wanted a meaningful equity stake transferred to a workers' governance fund, not a token position but a genuine voting block, jointly overseen by employee representatives and by Owen in a fiduciary capacity. And he wanted a formal compensation process for every engineer who had been pressured to suppress a safety concern or forced from the company for refusing to falsify records. Victoria accepted all 4 conditions before he finished stating the last one. She transferred 26% of the family trust's voting control into the Workers' Governance Fund. Enough, combined with the employee equity already in circulation, to make the fund the single largest voting block at Sterling. with Owen and an elected labor council exercising that authority jointly. Owen would never describe himself as an owner of Sterling Rail Systems, but no significant decision about the company's future would be made without the people who built and maintained its trains having a real and binding voice in the outcome. Before the meeting concluded, he told Victoria she should continue as chief executive, with one condition he did not frame as negotiable. From that point forward, no one in a maintenance uniform at any Sterling facility would be treated as someone whose concerns could be dismissed before they were heard. 6 weeks after the demonstration, Victoria Sterling stood at the front of the main hall of Blackridge Terminal, the same hall, the same track, the same banks of light that had watched her laugh at a man with a mop in his hands, and she delivered a statement she had written herself, without a communications team, without a prepared script designed to manage the reputational exposure. She told the people in that hall that Owen Barrett was the co-inventor of the Sentinel safety protocol, that Sterling Rail Systems had used his intellectual property for years while removing his name from every record that could have acknowledged it, that the investigation report from the Aero Zero incident had been falsified with the knowledge of senior leadership, and that her own father had chosen to sacrifice an innocent man rather than face the consequences of what his company had done. And she was standing in the building her father built to say that clearly. She said she had assessed Owen's capabilities based on the clothing he was wearing when she met him that morning, and that this was wrong in a way she did not expect a single public statement to resolve, but that she intended to demonstrate over time that she understood the nature of what she had done. Owen's name was formally restored to the Sentinel patent record and to every design document in Sterling's internal and public archive. The equity settlement provided him with the accumulated stake that should have been recognized over 7 years of credited co-invention, transferred into the workers' governance fund at his instruction rather than held in his personal account. He did not take any executive title. He became Sterling's principal architect of systems safety and co-chair of the newly established Independent Oversight Board, a position created to ensure that the technical judgment of the people closest to the engineering carried binding weight in decisions affecting public safety, not subject to override by commercial pressure. Jonah remained as program lead for the Aero X1, and his first order under the new structure was a complete fleet inspection by an outside laboratory, every component tested against original factory certification records. Avery came to Blackridge Terminal on the day Owen's nameplate was installed outside the Safety Oversight Office, a small room adjacent to the engineering bay, positioned so that Owen could see the Aero X1's nose through the interior window. She stood beside him and read the plate, and he told her the title did not make him proud. What made him proud was that the system was finally allowed to operate the way it had been designed to operate, because a system that worked had always been more honest than the people who tried to manage it into silence. 1 year after the failed demonstration, the Aero X1 received federal certification for commercial test operations. Sterling Rail Systems was smaller than it had been. The financial restructuring required to stabilize the company after the investigation had reduced its scale, but it had also removed the debt structure that Blackwood had leveraged to make the company vulnerable in the first place, leaving an organization leaner and considerably more transparent than the one Harrison Sterling had handed to his daughter. The Workers' Fund held its first formal governance vote 6 months into the restructured arrangement, and the outcome confirmed what Owen had believed was achievable. People who understood the work made better decisions about the work than people who administered it from a distance. On the morning of the certification run, Avery sat in the passenger section of the Aero X1 alongside the engineers and technicians who had spent a year rebuilding the fleet from documented components outward. Victoria stood beside Owen in the operations center, the same room where, a year earlier, he had connected through a hardwired channel that Blackwood did not know existed and stopped a train that had been set up to destroy itself and everyone associated with it. She asked Owen whether he believed the Arrow X1 was ready. He checked the Sentinel signal, confirmed the brake controller certifications against the hardware signatures logged in the original system record, looked at the readouts one final time, and said the train had been ready for a long time. The question, he told her, was whether the company was ready to listen to it. Victoria said that this time they were going to listen. Arrow X1 left the platform and accelerated smoothly into the open corridor, its speed climbing through figures that the original prototype had never been permitted to reach, Sentinel reading every system correctly, every component responding precisely as documented, the architecture doing what it had always been built to do. There were no counterfeit parts. There were no erased names. There were no hands pressed together at the center of a room full of people who had not yet been told the truth. The train that Owen Barrett had built in someone else's name was finally moving under its own honest power, carrying forward everything a man had refused to let disappear into the open distance, exactly the way it had been designed.